What is the appeal of Tolkien? What was he all about? Let's find out. Wes Hall, min friend, and welcome to yet another video. My dear friends, what is the appeal of Tolkien? Well, I think that the answer is very simple, is it not? Or is it? Well, of course, there can be just one answer, or there can be 1,000 answers. It, of course, depends on who you're asking. And why am I making this video in the first place? Because with the arrival of all these adaptations and anti-adaptations, in the case of The Rings of Power, which of course brings more and more people into the genre of fantasy, and of course, in general, with more generations, we are getting more people who are only now discovering the works of Professor Tolkien, either through just word of mouth, somebody recommending the books to them, or I would say in our day and age, more often through an adaptation like the Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson. And then, of course, you've got a lot of people on the internet, because the social media is very much the thing now. And the information that we find there is not always kosher. And that everybody thinks they can express their own opinions, and that their opinion is the only correct one. And then, of course, you've got 1,000 people, and these 1,000 people will look at Tolkien from 1,000 different points of view. So that, for example, means that I have been contacted by people who have approached Tolkien only and exclusively from the point of view of a Catholic, of a Christian, because Tolkien was a devout Catholic. His work was from a huge part inspired and influenced by Catholicism, by his faith, so on and so forth. But we also have to take into consideration that Tolkien was a versatile man. His faith was not what defined him. I know many people would like that. I know that many people are, extremely religious, and they just want to claim Tolkien as their own. But there are certain things that they would be angry if they heard or knew it. For example, that Tolkien loved the pagan myths and legends of old Europe, and that he used them vastly in his works, such as the Icelandic Edda. He was taking dwarf names from Voluspa. So then, of course, we can state the facts, those simple facts that people are getting to know more and more today, thanks to the globalization of Tolkien, that he was an extremely genius and skilled philologist, a linguist, a man who loved languages and their historical forms and dead languages, and who was creating his own artificial languages, a man who loved myths and legends, a man who loved stories, who simply loved storytelling, a man who was in love with the old values, the chivalric values of the Middle Ages, the medieval Europe. A man who extremely loved his country, who loved England. A man who was, a very, very good man, and who really cared about details. A man who was able to work on his entire world, the Arda, for his entire life, basically, for decades and decades and decades. Man who started writing the Book of Lost Tales in the ditches of the First World War. And then, of course, a man who, and that most people in the world know him as, one of the most influential fantasy writers of the 20th century. A man who was inspired, a man who was influenced by many things, but in no way a man who would be copying something, or ripping something off, or writing fan fiction, as some people said. There is The Fall of Arthur, and a couple of more poems in which he guessed what could have been in a found old text that was incomplete, but is far, far from being fan fiction. And on top of that, he was really able to afford it, being a genius that he was. So a man of many passions, a man of huge knowledge, a man of vast genius. So who is he, really? And what is the Lord of the Rings? What's his work. And I think that he actually wrote and mentioned it many a time in his letters, in his essays. For example, on fairy stories. Go ahead and read the essay called On Fairy Stories by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, and you will know that I'm speaking the truth here. He might have loved languages and philology and creating his own world, so on and so forth. But the core of the matter is, I think that the most important thing about The Lord of the Rings is that it is an escapist story. As simple as that. It is a fairy tale. It is a story about the fight and the struggle between the good and evil. The struggle and the fight between the good peoples of Middle-earth versus the Dark Lord Sauron. And then, of course, previously in the Book of Lost Tales, in the Silmarillion and things like that, with the elves and men and the Valar versus Morgoth. But we are here now focusing on The Lord of the Rings. And then, of course, The Lord of the Rings only exists because The Hobbit was written. It really serves as a sequel to The Hobbit, and The Hobbit was originally written for Tolkien's kids, as a fairy story, a bedside tale. So you might go into depth, and I have done this in my life. I wrote bloody hundreds and hundreds of texts at university on Tolkien. My bachelor thesis, my diploma thesis, they were both written about Tolkien before I was shadow banned and cancelled at university in my PhD studies. I was writing my dissertation on Tolkien, actually on the Fall of Arthur. So I know something about delving deep into Tolkien, like extremely and academically, and pondering over his text for hours and hours and hours without stopping. But I think that hobbits are perfect for really describing who Tolkien was and what he is all about. It's about the simple things in life, like escaping from, that which is bleak and dark. So, there will be, of course, 100 comments under this video. Everybody putting their own interpretation of Tolkien's works, of his stories. Feel free to do so. I always like to read your comments. I might agree with some, I might disagree with the rest. I think that with most I will disagree. But that's what it is all about, isn't it? We are talking about literature here. In many cases, it's not really black and white. In many cases, it's really subjective. But, and especially then, when we are talking about interpretation of text. 1,000 people will interpret a text 1,000 different ways. So if we want to really know my finishing thoughts about the entire matter, is I am able to look at Tolkien from 100 different points of view. But I choose to focus on the most simple one. On The Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion, being fairy stories, fairy tales, that I can read and escape from reality. I choose this simplicity. And it makes me feel very good. Alright then, let me know in the comments down below what you think. And there will be all. Thank you very much for watching. And I'm out of here.